Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I join the Prime Minister in welcoming my friend Imam Mahmood for coming here today and for the enormous humanity and presence of mind he showed on that terrible day a year ago when he prevented violence from breaking out on the streets of my constituency. And I thank him and all the religious leaders in the local community who did so much to bind people together. As a country, we should be bound together in condemning racism in any form wherever it arises. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased that the Prime Minister mentioned the Windrush generation, and I too join her in commemorating that event when the Windrush generation arrived in this country. I hope the hostile environment will be put behind us and that we will take this special moment today to welcome a daughter of the Windrush generation as a new member of this House, the Member of Parliament for Lewisham East. She brings enormous experience to this House in dealing with the problems of poverty and dislocation in her borough, and she will make a great contribution to this House. Mr. Speaker, today marks World Refugee Day, a time to reflect on the human misery of 65 million refugees displaced across the globe. There is a responsibility on all political leaders to both aid refugees and act to tackle the crises and the conflicts that are driving this vast movement of people. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister said that Well, thank you. The Prime Minister has said extra funding for the National Health Service will come from three sources: Brexit, economic growth and the taxation system. Well, there can be no Brexit dividend before 2022. Economic growth is the slowest since 2009. So, which taxes are going up?
Well, can I say to the right honourable gentleman, he mentioned a number of issues in his opening question. Can I first of all take this opportunity? Of saying that I was struck when I visited Finsbury Park Mosque after the attack by the very close work that was being done by a number of faith leaders in that community. I commend them for the work that they're doing, that they were doing then, that I know they continue to do, and that we see being done in other communities, including my own community in my constituency in Maidenhead. The right honourable gentleman ended up by asking a question on the National Health Service. So Can I be very clear about this? We have set out a long-term plan for the NHS. That is securing the future for the National Health Service. We have set a 5-year funding settlement. That will be funded. There will be money that we are no longer sending to the EU that we will be able to spend on our NHS. Well, honourable members may shout about this. I know that issue is not the policy of the Labour Party frontbench. In relation to money we're no longer sending to the EU being spent on the NHS, the Shadow Housing Secretary called it bogus. The Shadow Health Secretary said it's a deceit. But perhaps I can tell them what another Labour member said a few weeks ago. He said, "We will use the funds returned from Brussels after Brexit to invest in our public services." It was him, the right honourable gentleman, the Leader of the Opposition.
Corbyn! Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased the Prime Minister is reading my speeches so closely. I said that the money sent to the EU should be ring-fenced to replace structural funds to regions, agriculture and fishing industry support, funding for research and for universities. Mr. Speaker, could I remind the Prime Minister the question I asked was about taxation to deal with her NHS promises at the weekend. Last year, she might care to forget last summer actually, but she wrote in the Conservative manifesto, "Firms and households cannot plan ahead with the threat of unspecified higher taxes." By her own admission, households and businesses need to plan. So can she be straight with people? Which taxes are going up and for who?
Can I say to the right honourable gentleman, as I said on Monday, my right honourable friend the Chancellor will set out the full funding package. We're going to listen to people properly. He set it out properly before the spending review. But I'm interested that the right honourable gentleman has now confirmed that the Labour Party thinks there will be money coming back from the European Union. I have to say, I think that there will be one circumstance in which there will be no money coming back from the European Union. That's if we adopted Labour's policy of getting a deal at whatever the price.
Mr. Speaker, at the weekend, the Prime Minister said there will be about £600 million a week more being spent on the NHS in cash. That will be through the Brexit dividend. Well, our net contribution to the European Union is about £8.5 billion a year. £600 million a week is over £30 billion a year. Mr. Speaker, her figures are so dodgy they belong on the side of a bus. We expect that from the Foreign Secretary, but why is the Prime Minister pushing her own Mickey Mouse figures?
Can I say to the right honourable gentleman, he thanked me earlier for reading his speeches. Can I just suggest that he, or perhaps his researchers, should spend a little more time carefully reading and listening to what I actually say on his speeches. He has claimed that I said that by 2023-24 there would be £600 million more in cash terms per week being spent on the NHS from the Brexit dividend. No, I didn't say that. What I said was the following. There will indeed be £600 million more, around £600 million more, being spent on the NHS every week in cash terms as a result of a decision taken by this Conservative government to secure the future of the NHS. That will partly be funded by the money we no longer spend on the European Union. And as a country, we will be contributing a bit more. We will listen to views on that, and the Chancellor of the Exchequer, my right honourable friend, will bring forward that package before the spending review. But I have to say to the right honourable gentleman, if he is so concerned about people's taxation and what they're spending in tax, why is it that when we increase the personal allowance and have taken nearly 4 million people out of paying income tax altogether, he and the Labour Party opposed it?
Mr. Speaker, last night the Prime Minister sent an email to Conservative members telling them, and I quote, "The money we now send to the EU will go to the NHS." The government's own Office of Budget Responsibility says they won't see any dividend until at least 2023. The Prime Minister talks about a strong economy, but economic growth last year was the slowest of any major economy and already been downgraded this year. So if growth doesn't meet expectations, does that mean, this is the question, does that mean extra borrowing or higher mystery taxes?
Answer the question.
Can I say to the right honourable gentleman, it is the balanced approach that this government takes to our economy which has enabled us. Oh, they all groan. They don't like to hear, actually, that there is a fundamental difference between us, because we do believe in keeping taxes low, we do believe in putting money into our public services, and we also believe in dealing with our debt and making sure that we get debt falling. What would the Labour Party do? The Labour Party wouldn't have money to put in the National Health Service, because the Labour Party would bankrupt our economy. And yes, if we're talking about the amount of money that's being put into the NHS, let's just look at what the Labour Party offered at the last election. The Labour Party said that 2.2% more growth for the NHS would make it the envy of the world. Well, I have to say to my honourable and right honourable friends, I chose not to listen to that. We're not putting 2.2% growth in, we're putting 3.4% growth in.
Jeremy Corbyn!
Mr. Speaker, under Labour, the NHS increase would have been 5% this year. And the IFS confirmed that in this year there would be 7.7 billion more for the NHS. And what's her offer? A promise of £394 million per week without saying where any of it is coming from, apart from these mysterious phantom taxes that the Chancellor is presumably dreaming up at this very moment. But, Mr. Speaker, there is a human element to all issues surrounding the National Health Service and public spending. Let me give you an example. Virginia wrote to me last week and she says, my diabetic daughter has fallen down on 4 occasions in the last month. She now has both legs in plaster and is being told there isn't enough money for the NHS to give her a wheelchair. Mr. Speaker, the IFS studies say the NHS needs 3.3% just to maintain current provision, which I remind her are at crisis levels. Does she think standing still is good enough for Virginia or anybody else that's waiting for the treatment they need and deserve?
That's why we're putting in extra money to ensure that we see improved care in the NHS. But can I just remind him what the Chief Executive of NHS England, Simon Stevens, has said of our announcement? We can now face the next 5 years with renewed certainty. This multi-year settlement provides the funding we need to shape a long-term plan for key improvements in cancer, mental health and other critical services. And if he wants to talk about what the Labour Party do in relation to health service, that's where he started. Let's just look not at what they say but what they actually do. For every £1 extra we spend on the NHS in England, Labour in Wales spend only 84p. Typical Labour say one thing and do another.
Jeremy Corbyn!
Mr. Speaker, health spending grew by 5% in Wales last year, rather more than in England. Her 3.4% is actually just 3%, as it's only for NHS England. Nothing for public health budgets, nothing for community health, or vitally, nothing for social care. This is less than is needed just to stand still. And after the longest funding squeeze in history, A&E waits are their worst ever. 4 million people now waiting on NHS waiting lists. Cancer treatment target not met for over 3 years. Nurse numbers falling, GP numbers falling, and 100,000 staff vacancies. NHS trusts $1 billion in deficit and a £1.3 billion funding gap for social care. The Prime Minister is writing IOUs just to stand still. Until this government can be straight with people where the money is coming from, why should anyone, anywhere, trust them on the NHS?
I'll tell the right honourable gentleman why people should trust us on the National Health Service. For the 70 years of the National Health Service, for 43 of those years, it has been under the stewardship of a Conservative government. We have, despite taking difficult and necessary decisions on public spending in 2010, as a result of the deficit left by the last Labour government, we have consistently put extra money into the National Health Service. We have now announced a National Health Service plan that gives it certainty of funding for the next 5 years, and working with clinicians and others in the National Health Service, we will see a 10-year plan to improve services and to improve care for patients. But can I say to the right honourable gentleman, he can stand up here all he likes and talk about the Labour Party's plans for money. But what we know is that the Labour Party's plans would bankrupt this economy And the IFS have said Labour would not raise as much money as they claim, even in the short run, let alone the long run. In short, their plan absolutely doesn't add up. Conservatives putting more money into the National Health Service, Labour losing control of the public finances and bankrupting Britain.